I'm Naomi Booth and I teach in the English Studies department here at Durham, and I am particularly interested both in my teaching and my research in creative response alongside literary analysis. One of my interests as both a writer and an academic researcher is the relationship between environments and human bodies and the literary depictions of those relationships. And literary ecologies is how I think of those relationships. And I've become increasingly interested in the relationships between specific geographical regions and the literatures that they produce. So I was really delighted last year to have the chance to become involved in a project called HAG, which was all about revitalising regional folk tales, going back to the regions that they were originally told in and inviting contemporary writers to produce contemporary versions of certain folk tales that were at risk of going extinct. I was asked to research the folk tale of the Boggart, which was popular in the north of England and in some other regions too, but particularly in the north of England in the 19th century and before. And I'd come across the word Boggart. I grew up in West Yorkshire and continue to live in Yorkshire, and I realised I was familiar with the word Boggart but didn't know what it meant. And I'd come across the word Boggart in place names. So I'd known about the Boggart Stones on Saddleworth Moor and various other boggarty places that I'd come across on maps. And this is where I began my research. I thought about that association between the Boggart, tales of the Boggart, and places that were associated with danger, so rural locations in which there might be the possibility of isolation and danger, and some of the Boggart tales seem to act as a kind of warning. And I worked with Professor Carolyn Larrington at Oxford University, and she was the person who had provided source material for all of the writers in the different regions of Britain and Ireland. And she had come across a tale called I Were Flitting, which told the tale of a farmer called Honest George in Yorkshire, whose farm was haunted supposedly by a boggart. Or I shouldn't say haunted because they're not exactly ghosts, but their family was tormented by a boggart. And the tale goes, the original source material goes, that they were forced to leave because of the boggart. But upon leaving, carrying all their worldly goods on a cart behind them, they discovered that the boggart had stowed away with them. It was in the butter churn. So the final line of this tale goes something like, they decided to return to the house because they preferred to be tormented somewhere that they knew than go to the inconvenience of being tormented elsewhere, which seems kind of very phlegmatically Yorkshire to me. But some of the things that I was interested in reapproaching this material and trying to revitalise it for contemporary readers, some of those things involved thinking about farming today, and I decided to set the tale in the Calder Valley, an area I know quite well in West Yorkshire. And in my tale, George is a female farmer who arrives on the Pennines with her female partner, and they attempt to re-establish a dairy farm in quite harsh circumstances up high on the Pennine moors. So I was really interested in what it meant to attempt to create a kind of version of a female space of farming, and the sense in which these two characters are trying to produce a female agricultural space, but are threatened by lots of external forces as they do so. I was also really interested, it seemed to me that, like many folk tales, the supernatural element of Tales of the Boggart is also a really interesting way to think about the experience of trauma. So in the original tale, the farmer's wife is described as being almost frightened to death by the thought of the boggart. Not just the boggart's activities, but the way in which she thinks about the boggart. And the moral, if you like, at the end of that tale seems to be that you can't escape the boggart. You can't escape this terror that is visiting you, but you can in some ways reconcile yourself to it. And I started to wonder about what that might mean now in a contemporary context. So one of my characters, Ash, there's a sense in which the boggart is standing in, if you like, or is a way to think about her experience of trauma and what it might be not to run away from something, but to stay with it, or to attempt to create something new that incorporates rather than vanquishes that which has terrorised you. Another thing of interest to me as part of this project was the idea of oral storytelling. So Hag was originally commissioned by Audible. So there was a sense in which those of us who were involved were attempting to make a contribution to a very new oral storytelling tradition, which has sprung up recently through the popularity of podcasts and audiobooks and all sorts of audio drama series. So it was really interesting to work on older materials, but using very modern technology. So my piece, for example, which is called Sour Hall, used binaural sound. So there was a real sense of the listener being in the middle of the action. And I suppose it's interesting to think about the power of those oral traditions as we maybe enter a new golden age of oral storytelling that's been facilitated through new technologies. It's also been really wonderful to feel that I've been part of a transmission of stories that circulates, evolves, is changed and altered. So Sour Hall went on to be adapted early this year into a full-length audio drama by the writer Laura Kerwin Ashman, a brilliant drama starring Pearl Mackie and Lucy Fallon. So there's a sense in which she has then made that story hers, and hopefully it will continue to circulate in altered forms. And she's very interested in her version of the story in the idea of femgaze. She's a female writer and director, and she's attempting with that piece of audio drama to produce something that she describes as femgaze, making a space for female-centred drama and a woman behind the camera. It's not a camera, but a woman behind the audio equipment too. It seems to me to be a really good and interesting time to be thinking about regional traditions of storytelling, partly because I think there's been a real proliferation in the last couple of decades in modes of production that are based in the regions, by which I mean a kind of proliferation of independent small publishers, many of which are based in the north as well as in other regions in Britain and Ireland. And it really feels like there's a groundswell of excitement about both writers and publishers and other artists who are based outside of London at the moment. My own work is published by Dead Ink, a publisher in Liverpool, which is part of the Northern Fiction Alliance. And they're a group of publishers based in the north of England who are really interested in diverse storytelling and disseminating stories from different parts of the UK.